Humanism.
Humanism is a philosophical and ethical stance that emphasizes the value and agency of human beings, individually and collectively, and generally prefers critical thinking and evidence over established doctrine or faith. The meaning of the term humanism has fluctuated, according to the successive intellectual movements which have identified with it. Generally, however, humanism refers to a perspective that affirms some notion of a human nature. In modern times, humanist movements are typically aligned with secularism and with non-theistic religions. Historically, however, this was not always the case.
Background.
The word humanism is ultimately derived from the Latin concept humanitas, and, like most other words ending in ism, entered English in the 19th century. However, historians agree that the concept predates the label invented to describe it, encompassing the various meanings ascribed to humanitas, which included both benevolence toward one's fellow humans and the values imparted by boni literae or humane learning, literally good letters. In the 2nd century AD, a Latin grammarian, Aulus Gellius, c. 125 c. 180, complained. Gellius says that in his day humanitas is commonly used as a synonym for philanthropy, or kindness and benevolence toward one's fellow man. Gellius maintains that this common usage is wrong, and that model writers of Latin, such as Cicero and others, used the word only to mean what we might call humane, or polite learning, or the Greek equivalent paideia. Gellius became a favorite author in the Italian Renaissance, and, in 15th century Italy, teachers and scholars of philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric were called themselves humanists. Modern scholars, however, point out that Cicero, 106-43 BC, who was most responsible for defining and popularizing the term humanitas, in fact frequently used the word in both senses, as did his near contemporaries. For Cicero, a lawyer, what most distinguished humans from brutes was speech, which, allied to reason, could, and should, enable them to settle disputes and live together in concord and harmony under the rule of law. Thus humanitas included two meanings from the outset, and these continue in their modern derivative, humanism, which even today can refer to both humanitarian benevolence and to scholarship. During the French Revolution, and soon after, in Germany, by the left Hegelians, humanism began to refer to an ethical philosophy centered on humankind, without attention to the transcendent or supernatural. The designation religious humanism refers to organized groups that sprang up during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is similar to Protestantism, although centered on human needs, interests, and abilities rather than the supernatural. In the Anglophone world, such modern, organized forms of humanism, which are rooted in the 18th century Enlightenment, have to a considerable extent more or less detached themselves from the historic connection of humanism with classical learning and the liberal arts. The first Humanist Manifesto was issued by a conference held at the University of Chicago in 1933. Signatories included the philosopher John Dewey, but the majority were ministers, chiefly Unitarian, and theologians. They identified humanism as an ideology that espouses reason, ethics, and social and economic justice, and they called for science to replace dogma and the supernatural as the basis of morality and decision-making.
History.
In 1808 Bavarian educational commissioner Friedrich Emanuel Niethammer coined the term humanism as to describe the new classical curriculum he planned to offer in German secondary schools, and by 1836 the word humanism had been absorbed into the English language in this sense. The coinage gained universal acceptance in 1856, when German historian and philologist Georg Voigt used humanism to describe Renaissance humanism, the movement that flourished in the Italian Renaissance to revive classical learning, a use which won wide acceptance among historians in many nations, especially Italy. But in the mid-18th century, during the French Enlightenment, the other use of the term had become current. In 1765, the author of an anonymous article in a French Enlightenment periodical spoke of the general love of humanity. A virtue hitherto quite nameless among us, and which we will venture to call humanism, for the time has come to create a word for such a beautiful and necessary thing. The latter part of the 18th and the early 19th centuries saw the creation of numerous grassroots philanthropic and benevolent societies dedicated to human betterment and the spreading of knowledge, some Christian, some not. After the French Revolution, the idea that human virtue could be created by human reason alone independently from traditional religious institutions, attributed by opponents of the revolution to Enlightenment philosophers such as Rousseau, was violently attacked by influential religious and political conservatives, such as Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, as a deification or idolatry of man. Humanism began to acquire a negative sense. The Oxford English Dictionary records the use of the word humanism by an English clergyman in 1812 to indicate those who believe in the mere humanity, as opposed to the divine nature, of Christ, that is, Unitarians and deists. In this polarized atmosphere, in which established ecclesiastical bodies tended to circle the wagons and reflexively oppose political and social reforms like extending the franchise, universal schooling, and the like, liberal reformers and radicals embraced the idea of humanism as an alternative religion of humanity. The anarchist Proudhon, best known for declaring that property is theft, used the word humanism to describe a cult, deification de l'humanité, cult, deification of humanity, and Ernest Renan in L'Avenir de la Science, Pensées de 1848, The Future of Knowledge, Thoughts on 1848, 1848-49, states, "It is my deep conviction that pure humanism will be the religion of the future, that is, the cult of all that pertains to man, all of life, sanctified and raised to the level of a moral value." At about the same time, the word humanism as a philosophy centered around humankind, as opposed to institutionalized religion, was also being used in Germany by the so-called left Hegelians, Arnold Ruge, and Karl Marx, who were critical of the close involvement of the Church in the repressive German government. There has been a persistent confusion between the several uses of the terms. Philanthropic humanists look to what they consider their antecedents in critical thinking and human-centered philosophy among the Greek philosophers and the great figures of Renaissance history. And scholarly humanists stress the linguistic and cultural disciplines needed to understand and interpret these philosophers and artists.
Predecessors. Asia.
Human-centered philosophy that rejected the supernatural can be found also circa 1500 BCE in the Lokayata system of Indian philosophy. Nasadiyar Sukta, a passage in the Rig Veda, contains one of the first recorded assertion of agnosticism. In the 6th century BCE, Gautama Buddha expressed, in Pali literature, a skeptical attitude towards the supernatural. Another instance of ancient humanism as an organized system of thought is found in the Gathas of Zarathustra, composed between 1000 BCE, 600 BCE in Greater Iran. Zarathustra's philosophy in the Gathas lays out a conception of mankind as thinking beings dignified with choice and agency according to the intellect which each receives from Ahura Mazda, God in the form of supreme wisdom. The idea of Ahura Mazda as a non-intervening deistic divine God grand architect of the universe tied with a unique eschatology and ethical system implying that each person is held morally responsible for their choices, made freely in this present life, in the afterlife. The importance placed on thought, action, responsibility, and a non-intervening creator was appealed to by, and inspired a number of, Enlightenment humanist thinkers in Europe such as Voltaire and Montesquieu. In China, Huangdi is regarded as the humanistic primogenitor. Sage kings such as Yao and Shan are humanistic figures as recorded. King Wu of Zhou has the famous saying, "Humanity is the ling, efficacious essence, of the world, among all." Among them Duke of Zhou, respected as a founder of Ruja, Confucianism, is especially prominent and pioneering in humanistic thought. His words were recorded in the Book of History as follows. Translation. In the 6th century BCE, Taoist teacher Lao Tzu espoused a series of naturalistic concepts with some elements of humanistic philosophy. The Silver Rule of Confucianism from Analects 1524, is an example of ethical philosophy based on human values rather than the supernatural. Humanistic thought is also contained in other Confucian classics, for example, as recorded in Zuo Zhuan, Ji Liang says, people as the Tzu, master, lord, dominance, owner or origin, of gods. So, to sage kings, people first, gods second. Nishiguo says, gods, clever, righteous and wholehearted, comply with human. Taoist and Confucian secularism contain elements of moral thought devoid of religious authority or deism, however they only partly resembled our modern concept of secularism.
Ancient Greece.
6th century BCE pre-Socratic Greek philosophers Thales of Miletus and Xenophanes of Colophon were the first in the region to attempt to explain the world in terms of human reason rather than myth and tradition, thus can be said to be the first Greek humanists. Thales questioned the notion of anthropomorphic gods and Xenophanes refused to recognize the gods of his time and reserved the divine for the principle of unity in the universe. These Ionian Greeks were the first thinkers to assert that nature is available to be studied separately from the supernatural realm. Anaxagoras brought philosophy and the spirit of rational inquiry from Ionia to Athens. Pericles, the leader of Athens during the period of its greatest glory, was an admirer of Anaxagoras. Other influential pre-Socratics or rational philosophers include Protagoras, like Anaxagoras, a friend of Pericles, known for his famous dictum "Man is the measure of all things," and Democritus, who proposed that matter was composed of atoms. Little of the written work of these early philosophers survives, and they are known mainly from fragments and quotations in other writers, principally Plato and Aristotle. The historian Thucydides, noted for his scientific and rational approach to history, is also much admired by later humanists. In the 3rd century BCE, Epicurus became known for his concise phrasing of the problem of evil, lack of belief in the afterlife, and human-centered approaches to achieving eudaimonia. He was also the first Greek philosopher to admit women to his school as a rule.
Medieval Islam.
Many medieval Muslim thinkers pursued humanistic, rational and scientific discourses in their search for knowledge, meaning and values. A wide range of Islamic writings on love, poetry, history and philosophical theology show that medieval Islamic thought was open to the humanistic ideas of individualism, occasional secularism, skepticism, and liberalism. According to Imad ad-Din Ahmad, another reason the Islamic world flourished during the Middle Ages was an early emphasis on freedom of speech, as summarized by al-Hashimi, a cousin of Caliph al-Ma'mun, in the following letter to one of the religious opponents he was attempting to convert through reason. According to George Makdisi, certain aspects of Renaissance humanism has its roots in the medieval Islamic world, including the art of dictation, called in Latin, ars dictumnis, and the humanist attitude toward classical language.
Renaissance.
Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement in Europe of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period. The 19th-century German historian Georg Voigt, 1827-91, identified Petrarch as the first Renaissance humanist. Paul Johnson agrees that Petrarch was the first to put into words the notion that the centuries between the fall of Rome and the present had been the age of darkness. According to Petrarch, what was needed to remedy this situation was the careful study and imitation of the great classical authors. For Petrarch and Boccaccio, the greatest master was Cicero, whose prose became the model for both learned, Latin, and vernacular, Italian, prose. The basic training of the humanist was to speak well and write, typically, in the form of a letter. One of Petrarch's followers, Colluxio Salutati, 1331–1406, was made Chancellor of Florence, whose interests he defended with his literary skill. The Visconti of Milan claimed that Salutati's pen had done more damage than 30 squadrons of Florentine cavalry. Contrary to a still widely current interpretation that originated in Voigt's celebrated contemporary, Jacob Burckhardt, and which was adopted wholeheartedly, especially by those moderns calling themselves humanists, most specialists now do not characterize Renaissance humanism as a philosophical movement, nor in any way as anti-Christian or even anti-clerical. A modern historian has this to say. The Humanisti criticized what they considered the barbarous Latin of the universities, but the revival of the humanities largely did not conflict with the teaching of traditional university subjects, which went on as before. Nor did the humanists view themselves as in conflict with Christianity. Some, like Salutati, were the chancellors of Italian cities, but the majority, including Petrarch, were ordained as priests, and many worked as senior officials of the papal court. Humanist Renaissance popes Nicholas V, Pius II, Sixtus IV, and Leo X wrote books and amassed huge libraries. In the High Renaissance, in fact, there was a hope that more direct knowledge of the wisdom of antiquity, including the writings of the Church Fathers, the earliest known Greek texts of the Christian Gospels, and in some cases even the Jewish Kabbalah, would initiate a harmonious new era of universal agreement. With this end in view, Renaissance church authorities afforded humanists what in retrospect appears a remarkable degree of freedom of thought. One humanist, the Greek Orthodox Platonist Gemistus Pletho, 1355–1452, based in Maestras, Greece, but in contact with humanists in Florence, Venice, and Rome, taught a Christianized version of pagan polytheism.
Back to the sources.
The humanists' close study of Latin literary texts soon enabled them to discern historical differences in the writing styles of different periods. By analogy with what they saw as decline of Latin, they applied the principle of ad fontes, or back to the sources, across broad areas of learning, seeking out manuscripts of patristic literature as well as pagan authors. In 1439, while employed in Naples at the court of Alfonso V of Aragon, at the time engaged in a dispute with the Papal States, the humanist Lorenzo Valla used stylistic textual analysis, now called philology, to prove that the donation of Constantine, which purported to confer temporal powers on the Pope of Rome, was an 8th-century forgery. For the next 70 years, however, neither Valla nor any of his contemporaries thought to apply the techniques of philology to other controversial manuscripts in this way. Instead, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire to the Turks in 1453, which brought a flood of Greek Orthodox refugees to Italy, humanist scholars increasingly turned to the study of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, hoping to bridge the differences between the Greek and Roman churches, and even between Christianity itself and the non-Christian world. The refugees brought with them Greek manuscripts, not only of Plato and Aristotle, but also of the Christian Gospels, previously unavailable in the Latin West. After 1517, when the new invention of printing made these texts widely available, the Dutch humanist Erasmus, who had studied Greek at the Venetian printing house of Aldus Manutius, began a philological analysis of the Gospels in the spirit of Valla, comparing the Greek originals with their Latin translations with a view to correcting errors and discrepancies in the latter. Erasmus, along with the French humanist Jacques Lefebvre Tepels, began issuing new translations, laying the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. Henceforth Renaissance humanism, particularly in the German north, became concerned with religion, while Italian and French humanism concentrated increasingly on scholarship and philology addressed to a narrow audience of specialists, studiously avoiding topics that might offend despotic rulers or which might be seen as corrosive of faith. After the Reformation, critical examination of the Bible did not resume until the advent of the so-called higher criticism of the 19th-century German Tübingen school.
Consequences.
The ad fontes principle also had many applications. The rediscovery of ancient manuscripts brought a more profound and accurate knowledge of ancient philosophical schools such as Epicureanism, and Neoplatonism, whose pagan wisdom the humanists, like the Church Fathers of old, tended, at least initially, to consider as deriving from divine revelation and thus adaptable to a life of Christian virtue. The line from a drama of Terence, Homo sum, humani nihilum eolinum puto, or with nil for nihil, meaning I am a human being, I think nothing human alien to me, known since antiquity through the endorsement of St. Augustine, gained renewed currency as epitomizing the humanist attitude. Better acquaintance with Greek and Roman technical writings also influenced the development of European science, see the history of science in the Renaissance. This was despite what A. C. Crombie, viewing the Renaissance in the 19th century manner as a chapter in the heroic march of progress, calls a backwards-looking admiration for antiquity, in which Platonism stood in opposition to the Aristotelian concentration on the observable properties of the physical world. But Renaissance humanists, who considered themselves as restoring the glory and nobility of antiquity, had no interest in scientific innovation. However, by the mid to late 16th century, even the universities, though still dominated by scholasticism, began to demand that Aristotle be read in accurate texts edited according to the principles of Renaissance philology, thus setting the stage for Galileo's quarrels with the outmoded habits of scholasticism. Just as artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci, partaking of the zeitgeist though not himself a humanist, advocated study of human anatomy, nature, and whether to enrich Renaissance works of art, so Spanish-born humanist Juan Luis Vives, c. 1493–1540, advocated observation, craft, and practical techniques to improve the formal teaching of Aristotelian philosophy at the universities, helping to free them from the grip of medieval scholasticism. Thus, the stage was set for the adoption of an approach to natural philosophy, based on empirical observations and experimentation of the physical universe, making possible the advent of the age of scientific inquiry that followed the Renaissance. It was in education that the humanists' program had the most lasting results, their curriculum and methods.
From Renaissance to modern humanism.
Early humanists saw no conflict between reason and their Christian faith, see Christian humanism. They inveighed against the abuses of the Church, but not against the Church itself, much less against religion. For them, the word secular carried no connotations of disbelief, that would come later, in the 19th century. In the Renaissance, to be secular meant simply to be in the world rather than in a monastery. Petrarch frequently admitted that his brother Rado's life as a Carthusian monk was superior to his own, although Petrarch himself was in minor orders and was employed by the Church all his life. He hoped that he could do some good by winning earthly glory and praising virtue, inferior though that might be to a life devoted solely to prayer. The methods of the humanists, however, combined with their eloquence, would ultimately have a corrosive effect on established authority.
19th and 20th centuries.
The phrase "the religion of humanity" is sometimes attributed to American founding father Thomas Paine, though as yet unattested in his surviving writings. According to Tony Davis, identifies Paine's The Age of Reason as a link between the two major narratives of what Jean-François Lyotard calls the narrative of legitimation, the rationalism of the 18th century philosophers, and the radical, historically based German 19th-century biblical criticism of the Hegelians David Friedrich Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach. The first is political, largely French in inspiration, and projects humanity as the hero of liberty. The second is philosophical, German, seeks the totality and autonomy of knowledge, and stresses understanding rather than freedom as the key to human fulfillment and emancipation. The two themes converged and competed in complex ways in the 19th century and beyond, and between them set the boundaries of its various humanisms. Homo homini deus est, man is a god to man, or God is nothing man to himself, Feuerbach had written. Victorian novelist Mary Ann Evans, known to the world as George Eliot, translated Strauss's Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus, 1846, and Ludwig Feuerbach's Das Wesen Christianismus, The Essence of Christianity. She wrote to a friend. Eliot and her circle, who included her companion George Henry Lewes, the biographer of Goethe, and the abolitionist and social theorist Harriet Martineau, were much influenced by the positivism of Auguste Comte, whom Martineau had translated. Comte had proposed an atheistic cult founded on human principles, a secular religion of humanity, which worshipped the dead, since most humans who have ever lived are dead, complete with holidays and liturgy, modeled on the rituals of what was seen as a discredited and dilapidated Catholicism. Although Comte's English followers, like Eliot and Martineau, for the most part rejected the full gloomy panoply of his system, they liked the idea of a religion of humanity. Comte's austere vision of the universe, his injunction to vivre pour autrui, live for others, from which comes the word altruism, and his idealization of women inform the works of Victorian novelists and poets from George Eliot and Matthew Arnold to Thomas Hardy. The British Humanistic Religious Association was formed as one of the earliest forerunners of contemporary chartered humanist organisations in 1853 in London. This early group was democratically organised, with male and female members participating in the election of the leadership, and promoted knowledge of the sciences, philosophy, and the arts. In February 1877, the word was used pejoratively, apparently for the first time in America, to describe Felix Adler. Adler, however, did not embrace the term, and instead coined the name ethical culture for his new movement, a movement which still exists in the now humanist-affiliated New York Society for Ethical Culture. In 2008, ethical culture leaders wrote, "Today, the historic identification, ethical culture, and the modern description, ethical humanism, are used interchangeably." Active in the early 1920s, F.C.S. Schiller labeled his work humanism, but for Schiller the term referred to the pragmatist philosophy he shared with William James. In 1929, Charles Francis Potter founded the first Humanist Society of New York, whose advisory board included Julian Huxley, John Dewey, Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann. Potter was a minister from the Unitarian tradition, and in 1930 he and his wife, Clara Cook Potter, published Humanism, A New Religion. Throughout the 1930s, Potter was an advocate of such liberal causes as women's rights, access to birth control, civil divorce laws, and an end to capital punishment. Raymond B. Bragg, the associate editor of The New Humanist, sought to consolidate the input of Leon Milton Burkhead, Charles Francis Potter, and several members of the Western Unitarian Conference. Bragg asked Roy Wood Sellers to draft a document based on this information, which resulted in the publication of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. Potter's book and the manifesto became the cornerstones of modern humanism, the latter declaring a new religion by saying, "Any religion that can hope to be a synthesizing and dynamic force for today must be shaped for the needs of this age. To establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present." It then presented 15 theses of humanism as foundational principles for this new religion. In 1941, the American Humanist Association was organized. Noted members of the AHA included Isaac Asimov, who was the president from 1985 until his death in 1992, and writer Kurt Vonnegut, who followed as honorary president until his death in 2007. Gore Vidal became honorary president in 2009. Robert Buckman was the head of the association in Canada, and is now an honorary president. After World War II, 3 prominent humanists became the first directors of major divisions of the United Nations: Julian Huxley of UNESCO, Brock Chisholm of the World Health Organization, and John Boyd Orr of the Food and Agricultural Organization. In 2004, American Humanist Association, along with other groups representing agnostics, atheists, and other free thinkers, joined to create the Secular Coalition for America, which advocates in Washington, D.C. the separation of church and state and nationally for the greater acceptance of non-theistic Americans. The executive director of Secular Coalition for America is Sean Faircloth, a longtime state legislator from Maine.
Types. Renaissance.
Renaissance humanism was an activity of cultural and educational reform engaged in by civic and ecclesiastical chancellors, book collectors, educators, and writers, who by the late 15th century began to be referred to as humanistic humanists. It developed during the 14th and the beginning of the 15th centuries, and was a response to the challenge of scholastic university education, which was then dominated by Aristotelian philosophy and logic. Scholasticism focused on preparing men to be doctors, lawyers or professional theologians, and was taught from approved textbooks in logic, natural philosophy, medicine, law and theology. There were important centers of humanism at Florence, Naples, Rome, Venice, Mantua, Ferrara, and Urbino. Humanists reacted against this utilitarian approach and the narrow pedantry associated with it. They sought to create a citizenry, frequently including women, able to speak and write with eloquence and clarity and thus capable of engaging the civic life of their communities and persuading others to virtuous and prudent actions. This was to be accomplished through the study of the Studia Humanitatis, today known as the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry and moral philosophy. As a program to revive the cultural, and particularly the literary legacy and moral philosophy of classical antiquity, humanism was a pervasive cultural mode and not the program of a few isolated geniuses like Rabelais or Erasmus as is still sometimes popularly believed.
Secular.
Secular humanism is a comprehensive life stance or worldview which embraces human reason, metaphysical naturalism, altruistic morality and distributive justice, and consciously rejects supernatural claims, theistic faith and religiosity, pseudoscience, and superstition. It is sometimes referred to as humanism, with a capital H and no qualifying adjective. The International Humanist and Ethical Union, IHEU, is the world union of 117 humanist, rationalist, irreligious, atheistic, bright, secular, ethical culture, and free thought organizations in 38 countries. The happy human is the official symbol of the IHEU as well as being regarded as a universally recognized symbol for secular humanism. According to the IHEU's Bylaw 5.1.
Religious.
Religious humanism is an integration of humanist ethical philosophy with religious rituals and beliefs that center on human needs, interests, and abilities. Though practitioners of religious humanism did not officially organize under the name of humanism until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, non-theistic religions paired with human-centered ethical philosophy have a long history. The cult of reason, French, culte de la raison, was a religion based on deism devised during the French Revolution by Jacques Hébert, Pierre Gaspard Chaumette and their supporters. In 1793 during the French Revolution, the Cathedral Notre-Dame de Paris was turned into a temple to reason, and for a time Lady Liberty replaced the Virgin Mary on several altars. In the 1850s, Auguste Comte, the father of sociology, founded positivism, a religion of humanity. One of the earliest forerunners of contemporary chartered humanist organizations was the Humanistic Religious Association formed in 1853 in London. This early group was democratically organized, with male and female members participating in the election of the leadership and promoted knowledge of the sciences, philosophy, and the arts. The ethical culture movement was founded in 1876. The movement's founder, Felix Adler, a former member of the Free Religious Association, conceived of ethical culture as a new religion that would retain the ethical message at the heart of all religions. Ethical culture was religious in the sense of playing a defining role in people's lives and addressing issues of ultimate concern.
Polemics.
Polemics about humanism have sometimes assumed paradoxical twists and turns. Early 20th century critics such as Ezra Pound, T. E. Hume, and T. S. Eliot considered humanism to be sentimental slop, Hume, or overly feminine, Pound, and wanted to go back to a more manly, authoritarian society such as, they believed, existed in the Middle Ages. Postmodern critics who were self-described anti-humanists, such as Jean-François Lyotard and Michel Foucault, have asserted that humanism posits an overarching and excessively abstract notion of humanity or universal human nature, which can then be used as a pretext for imperialism and domination of those deemed somehow less than human. Philosopher Kate Soper notes that by faulting humanism for falling short of its own benevolent ideals, anti-humanism thus frequently secretes a humanist rhetoric. In his book, Humanism, 1997, Tony Davies calls these critics humanist anti-humanists. Critics of anti-humanism, most notably Jürgen Habermas, counter that while anti-humanists may highlight humanism's failure to fulfill its emancipatory ideal, they do not offer an alternative emancipatory project of their own. Others, like the German philosopher Heidegger, considered themselves humanists on the model of the ancient Greeks, but thought humanism applied only to the German race, and specifically to the Nazis, and thus, in Davies' words, were anti-humanist humanists. Such a reading of Heidegger's thought is itself deeply controversial. Heidegger includes his own views and critique of humanism in Letter on Humanism. Davis acknowledges that after the horrific experiences of the wars of the 20th century it should no longer be possible to formulate phrases like the destiny of man or the triumph of human reason without an instant consciousness of the folly and brutality they drag behind them. For it is almost impossible to think of a crime that has not been committed in the name of human reason. Yet, he continues, it would be unwise to simply abandon the ground occupied by the historical humanisms. For one thing, humanism remains on many occasions the only available alternative to bigotry and persecution. The freedom to speak and write, to organize and campaign in defense of individual or collective interests, to protest and disobey, all these can only be articulated in humanist terms. Modern humanists, such as Corliss Lamont or Carl Sagan, hold that humanity must seek for truth through reason and the best observable evidence and endorse scientific skepticism and the scientific method. However, they stipulate that decisions about right and wrong must be based on the individual and common good, with no consideration given to metaphysical or supernatural beings. The idea is to engage with what is human. Contemporary humanism entails a qualified optimism about the capacity of people, but it does not involve believing that human nature is purely good or that all people can live up to the humanist ideals without help. If anything, there is recognition that living up to one's potential is hard work and requires the help of others. The ultimate goal is human flourishing. Making life better for all humans, and as the most conscious species, also promoting concern for the welfare of other sentient beings and the planet as a whole. The focus is on doing good and living well in the here and now, and leaving the world a better place for those who come after. In 1925, the English mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead cautioned, "The prophecy of Francis Bacon has now been fulfilled. And man, who at times dreamt of himself as a little lower than the angels, has submitted to become the servant and the minister of nature." It still remains to be seen whether the same actor can play both parts.
Inclusive humanism.
Humanism increasingly designates an inclusive sensibility for our species, planet, and lives. While retaining the definition of the IHEU with regard to the life stance of the individual, inclusive humanism enlarges its constituency within Homo sapiens to consider humans' broadening powers and obligations. This accepting viewpoint recalls Renaissance humanism in that it presumes an advocacy role for humanists towards species governance, and this proactive stance is charged with a commensurate responsibility surpassing that of individual humanism. It identifies pollution, militarism, nationalism, sexism, poverty and corruption as being persistent and addressable human character issues incompatible with the interests of our species. It asserts that human governance must be unified and is inclusionary in that it does not exclude any person by reason of their collateral beliefs or personal religion alone. As such, it can be said to be a container for undeclared humanism, instilling a species credo to complement the personal tenets of individuals. Dwight Gilbert Jones writes that humanism may be the only philosophy likely to be adopted by our species as a whole. It is thus incumbent on inclusive humanists to not place unwarranted or self-interested conditions on its prospective adherents, nor associate it with religious acrimony.
Humanistic psychology.
Humanistic psychology is a psychological perspective which rose to prominence in the mid-20th century in response to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory and B.F. Skinner's behaviorism. The approach emphasizes an individual's inherent drive towards self-actualization and creativity. Psychologists Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow introduced a positive, humanistic psychology in response to what they viewed as the overly pessimistic view of psychoanalysis in the early 1960s. Other sources include the philosophies of existentialism and phenomenology.